my talk today will really look at how we have remembered Singapore and maybe some of the things we've forgotten about Singapore. And not us personally, but maybe generations over time. And at core, I want us to think about how place changes over time based on our own experiences, our own imagination, and that we can learn to see changes in physical geography, but also cultivate habits of attention of how we imagine places and the stories that we tell about them. We all know where we are, but I think it's helpful to talk a bit about maps today. Maps were certainly very important in the 19th century, and they're an important artifact and way of knowing, way of presenting information to us today. And so I'm struck by this, how the everyday way that we think about the landscape as we pull out our phones, right, or our GPS, and navigate around. And we can see the kind of echoes of the ways of seeing, of understanding the landscape, the physical landscape of water and land that remains very concrete in our imagination. And yet the ways, the significance of water, of moving by water versus land, very different, right, between the 19th century, as we'll see today. And those place names and the significance of place names on the map, what's important and what's not. The majority of this presentation will focus on New England migrants that came into the Great Lakes starting in the 19th century, or reaching a fever pitch in the middle of the 19th century. But I want to call special acknowledgement to the Anishinaabe people that were here long before migrants, European American migrants, came into this region, and we'll see some parallels and interaction between the kind of ways of knowing the land or experiencing the landscape as we go through our program today. This is a panel as part of our original Michiganders exhibit, which is outdoors in the garden. If you haven't had a chance to look at that, it, I think, gives you a really rich introduction to ways of thinking about Anishinaabe people, both not only in this pre-contact period, but also extending into the present day. Anishinaabe people are still here in this community, have always been in this community, and have important stories and perspectives to share with us. So as I thought about Singapore, one, it's a topic that is, I think, our most requested, most sought after area of history. We get lots of emails, lots of media contacts from people that want historic photos of Singapore. They want to know the story of this place. And I think it's useful to think about these historic markers, these artifacts or memory, places of memory, locations of memory, and ask some questions about them beyond using them as just illustrations, right? Of really thinking about the sort of deeper context of them, and that each of these artifacts, each of these photographs and maps and sites has a history, and often a multivalent history, right? One that contains really many different meanings at the same time. So stick with me. I want to walk through some of these examples and kind of help you maybe think about, come away with some different sorts of questions to ask about this history and what historians have done and do currently. So Singapore, what do we know about Singapore? We know a lot. There's a lot written about it. There's a lot of discussion about the place, both back in the 19th century and into the present day, into the 21st century. It is a space that is quite layered in its meaning as we start to think about it. And this photograph is really the documentary record we have, certainly the most engaging record that we have of the place. And we'll take a little deeper dive into what we're looking at, but just kind of hold this image in your mind. How many of you have seen this image before? All right. How many of you really looked carefully at this image before? Maybe a couple people? Yeah.
Well, I'm seeing things I haven't seen before.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think there's many things going on in this photograph and many questions we can ask about. We can ask of the photograph as we look at it. Is a portrait of an industrial landscape, of an industrial process that is embedded in between sand and water, between the Kalamazoo River and the high dunes immediately to the north and to the west of it. I spent a lot of time looking at this photograph, and I'll just point out one or two things right now. One is just the choice of creating this photograph. Why? We generally don't go on vacation today and take lots of photos of factories or industrial landscapes. But in the 19th century, they did, right? So this was, who took this photograph and why? What were they documenting? What was the power of these 15 feet tall piles of air drying lumber, right, that we see here that are about to be loaded and going to Chicago, right? One thing that I'll point out that's just a kind of fun aha moment. I spent a lot of time looking at this photograph, and it finally dawned on me one day that we're actually looking at the dunes in the background, right? The background of the photograph, which maybe you all picked up right away. But because of photography, this is taken sometime in the late 1860s or early 1870. Long exposure time. This is the same photographic process used during the American Civil War. Incredibly crisp detail, large glass plate negatives. Long exposure times, relatively long exposure times, 30 seconds or more. And the effect of that was very crisp detail, but the sky is always washed out. It always looks overcast. It's always overexposed by our standards. And so these dunes, which are very bright and sandy, are just washed right into the sky. This is the modern channel that's going out to Lake Michigan, right about here. That photograph is one that I think almost anyone would recognize. It's probably the first search result if you look for a photograph of Singapore. We can think of some other ways of knowing or markers of place, relics of Singapore. Singapore money is something. How many of you have seen sort of Bank of Singapore banknotes, either reproduction ones or real ones? We have some we'll show you. This is an uncut sheet of those banknotes that was donated to the History Center. And this is the plat of Singapore made by Oshea Wilder in 1833, dated in 1833. And I bring these two together of thinking about kind of the formal similarities between these fancy engraved banknotes printed on linen paper sheets to be cut, and some parallels between the grid-like arrangement of lots and streets and blocks. As Singapore is imagined in sort of two different but very parallel ways of thinking about money, right? The division of land and the investment in industrial infrastructure is kind of, these two things are linked together, right? This is about money and investment in the 1830s at the lakeshore. So just to kind of, we made some reference to this already, but thinking about maps, we're so fortunate. There's just all of these incredible ways we have to visualize the landscape in the 21st century. So this is straight off of Google Earth. And I sort of added a very rough place marker for the location of Singapore from the 1830s until about 1875. You get a sense of this. I really want to highlight the way that the physical landscape is so ever-changing in this place where we live. Some of it through man-made actions, the dredging of the modern channel that you see dating from in 1906, and the effect that has on the 19th century course of the river, right, which becomes the lagoon, becomes the Oxbow Lagoon today. It might be a little bit clearer as we look at this In this view here, this bird's eye view of the Kalamazoo River, done sometime between about 1915 and 1930. Don't have a specific date, but this I think it's just a wonderful, wonderful illustration that highlights how people are coming to Saugatuck in the early 20th century by steamer, as well as by automobile and by interurban, electric train, electric streetcar, and some very recognizable landscape features on the landscape as we're looking here as well. One reason I included this drawing as well is the correction that was added to this map by someone here at the History Center a number of years ago. The correct location of Singapore here, as opposed to where the illustrator put it in the 19-teens or 20s, locating it over here, which would be in the natural area today on the south shore of the Kalamazoo River. And I wanted to point that out because I think it's really really illustrative of the ways that we know Singapore is so familiar to us, and yet there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty about the landscape. Where was that in the dunes exactly? Where are these buildings? What are these buildings and artifacts that we see emerging as we look around? But this sense of change in the landscape is one that is very much with us today, is very much part of the deep conflict around how should we care for, how should we use the Kalamazoo River mouth. And this view here, I think, gives you some sense of that landscape. And I hope one takeaway you'll have from the program by the end is that this is a landscape that has gone through a lot of change over the last several hundred years. And I think there's some important points we can take away for thinking about that as we go. I'm kind of highlighting this at the beginning because I think it is important for understanding, important context for understanding Singapore and the ways in which its location has shifted so dramatically in terms of its relationship to Lake Michigan, to Saugatuck, to the hinterland of the Kalamazoo. So just highlighting some things if you haven't had a chance to really think about these places. The channel today, how we get to Lake Michigan, is fairly modern, right, dating back to 1906. The course of the river itself is fundamentally different. The view at Singapore's peak of the mouth of the Kalamazoo River looked like this. And so this is the location of the Kalamazoo River lighthouse that you see right here on the screen. This was the location of Saugatuck's fish town community. You can see about a dozen fishing shanties that are all kind of along the dunes here on the north side of the river. If you've been out to Oval Beach or hiking in the natural area, you might recognize this spot, but you might not, right? Because if you're walking along Oval Beach, you may not recognize, there's really very, very little to indicate that this was the mouth of the river up until the 1910s, okay? The water is much lower now, so we can actually see the pilings that are going out in Lake Michigan. When we had high water, you could not really discern those all that readily. But this was the mouth of the river that those great lumber schooners, steamships came in up until about 1906, okay? There's a lot I'm going to just leave out of this presentation for the sake of time. So this will not be like an encyclopedic discussion of what we know about Singapore or about this area in the 19th century. This is one of the oldest maps we have in the History Center collection. This map was printed in 1844 and revised many times, both prior to this printing in 1844 and then many editions following after that. It's on view downstairs in the map room, so you can look at this up close after the program if you'd like. I'll point out that it has some provenance connected with southwestern Michigan. There's some inscription on the interior, the inside of this booklet that references St. Joseph and Detroit and dates around the 1850s. But this map would have originally folded up to fit inside of this pocket leather booklet. And it's a traveler's map, right? As it's described itself, and it features all kinds of details, some of which you would expect, rivers and place names, town names, canals as well, and reveals a lot of information for us to think about for this region. We can see, we'll go in a little bit more detailed here, and we can see the Kalamazoo River. I bring this in, it's really special for us because here's the Kalamazoo River, here's Allegan, here's the Rabbit River, and here is Singapore on the north shore, and on the south shore on this map is a place called Breeze. And some of you may have heard of that place name before. If you did, it would have been through historians writing about it because it was never officially platted, the plat was never registered, was never built, but did appear on maps in the 1830s, on the 1844 map, where we see it on the screen right now. It was also noted in engineering plans for the Clinton and Kalamazoo Canal, which was planned and construction began on the east side of the state around 1837. And so the town of Breeze is really centered on Peach Orchard Creek, if you know where that is, just a bit west of Mack's Landing area. So I bring this in to kind of get you thinking about geography and our ways of mapping, our ways of knowing place, and that it can be, it's quite malleable, right? That information's changing. There was a lot of anticipation in the 1830s as Michigan's becoming a state. There's massive investment flowing into the Old Northwest Territory, and there's lots of real estate speculation, right, as we would call it today. Lots of people coming in and buying up land, of dividing land and hoping to sell it to people, of getting other investors to buy these things. And sometimes that worked out, and sometimes it really didn't, right? In the case of Breeze, that was a settlement that just never got off the ground. So switching gears a bit, thinking about the landscape, the most important ingredient in the story of Singapore is sand. It's certainly the thing we all think about the most, the city buried under the sand, the shifting sands that cover and uncover buildings, vegetation. And so we can think about how this existed, how people responded to that. And so Carl Herman, arguably Saugatuck's best known artist, I think has some interesting connections to this story. Included this painting from a private collection called Moving Sand that I think really captures the dynamic kind of plastic quality of the dune landscape. And we can see here trees that are trees and roots that have been exposed, uncovered as these dunes continue to shift and move around. And we included this photo here of Carl Herman from a newspaper article of him painting out in the dunes. So we can kind of see this close connection to landscape, this kind of painting from life, studying the dunescape. And it seemed to be a way of, it seemed to be very attractive or compelling to Herman in his art. This is an etching that he did called Derelicts at the Dunes, which showcased these derelict zombie trees that have been enveloped in the dunes. In some cases, hundreds of feet of tree covered by the dunes and then uncovered again later as the wind continues to blow and churn that sand around. I'm sure most all of you have been to the Saugatuck dune rides. It's probably one of the best experiential tours you can take to understand this landscape because you do get to go out into this space and into this really otherworldly environment, right? It's just a really exceptional landscape that kind of challenges our ways of thinking about a kind of linear accretion of soils and the slow buildup over time, change over time as additive. In this case, it can be additive or it can be subtractive and very quickly as well. So Saugatuck dune rides, great way to experience this phenomena of the plasticity of the dunes and of the landscape in a really rich way. So we talk a little bit about historians, important historians, and really think about their role in their approaches to history and hopefully draw out some subtle contrasts between them. as we're talking. And so the most influential historian of thinking about Singapore, Kit Lane, publishes on Singapore this first monograph pamphlet in 1975, Singapore, the Buried City, and then again in 1994 and in 2001 with the History Center exhibit Lost and Found Ghost Towns of Michigan. Kit's significance in my mind is she really, I think, calls attention to this, the ways that people starting back in the late 19th century are attracted to the buried city, right? Attracted to Michigan's Pompeii. And she finds, the earliest record that she finds dates back to 1887. Okay, so in 1887, an article appears in the popular press, Singapore, the deserted village of Michigan. This author writes in 1887, it is difficult as one looks on the elaborate map made by Mr. Oshea Wilder, the surveyor, nearly 50 years ago, to realize that this town with its broadly and regularly laid out streets is no more, and that as the semi-centennial of its boom approaches, nothing but a few deserted, decaying houses mark the spot, with sands drifting over them, as if they would bury the last vestiges of the place, while the wild waves breaking on the beach a few rods away chant a requiem. This is some capital R romanticism, right, of talking about Singapore back in the late 1800s. And it's only, as remarked here, this is about 50 years after the town of Singapore is platted, right? And it's really only about 12 years after it's really abandoned, right? After the mills leave. So there's this deep fascination with the plasticity of this dune landscape, of the reversal of fortune, the sense of progress reversed, that we're not in this moment of positivity where everything leads to better and greater and larger and more successful growing enterprises. Here is a reversal of that, right? And so there's this moment of reflecting upon that, even in 1887. Kit Lane writes about this. She is a journalist by training and a writer, and that shapes her history, as I read it, of really thinking about getting the story, right? Going to find those sources, tracking down those sources, and telling a compelling story that will really engage people, right? That will get in people's hands. They won't be able to put down, right? And her legacy as a successful and prolific author, we see some of the books highlighted here, both in her portrait, in her study, and also here. If you want to read more about Kit Lane, the Her Story exhibit downstairs features her biography and a whole library of her publications there. So she is hugely influential in promoting this story, of getting it in front of people, and of being on the beat, right? Going to find these historic photographs, finding these stories, and pulling this material together. One of the challenges of this, however, of the landscape itself, is that plasticity, that ever-changing nature of it. So this photograph here is often used, is probably, again, one of the top photos that gets reproduced about Michigan's Pompeii and Singapore. We don't really know exactly where this house is. We don't really know exactly when this house was built. The photograph may be from 1918 and maybe from as late as 1936. It could be on further north along the lakeshore as well. Additional photographs we have showing buildings buried in sand. Again, certainly fit the profile of the kinds of houses and buildings that would have been at Singapore built in the 1830s to the 1860s, but we're just not sure. But I think regardless, what an incredible, kind of sight to imagine the power of sand to sort of incessantly move, right, and cover and envelop these buildings. A few years ago, this example was shared with me as a New York Times profile of this town, this fishing village on the Arctic Sea in a place called Shoina, Russia. It's a fishing village. The only way to access it is by boat or by helicopter today. But as a town, it's like a modern Singapore. So we actually have modern day photographs of it, of these buildings that are enveloped by the dunes that are sort of ever encroaching around them. So I include this here just as kind of interesting parallel that there's few things that are totally new in the world, and these natural processes, right, continue on. It's not something that happened in the 1870s or 80s, and now the dunes are stopped. This process is always kind of there waiting for us if there's instability and lack of vegetation there. Kit Lane, promoting this story, calling attention to it, bringing together the sources to help create a factually based picture of this townscape, starting in the 1970s and continuing on into the 2000s. This is just kind of a reminder, that reference of our author there to that grand vision, right, of these streets and grid of houses and commercial blocks that were intended back in the early 1830s.
The names of the streets are not very clever.
Not very clever, fairly derivative. Broad Street, Detroit Street, Cherry Street, Pine, Chestnut, River, Oak, Walnut, Beach Street, which looks like it's spelled beach, like Oval Beach. So a bit of irony in naming that one. Certainly one of the significant historical markers as we look to remember Singapore is the state historic marker, which is not located at the site of Singapore, but located in front of City Hall, Village Hall in Saugatuck on Butler Street. And so the historic marker is dedicated in July of 1957, and we've got this well-reproduced photo here that tells a really fascinating story in and of itself. We see May Heath, who's here. We see John Paul standing here. And then our other two gentlemen that we see in the photo is Professor Charles Starring of Western Michigan University, who did quite a bit of research and writing about Singapore, and then Willard Wickers of Holland, who was the president of the State Historical Commission just prior to this. So I think there's more story to be told here of digging into this, the process of creating the marker. But from what we do know, right, it's a significant moment in Saugatuck's history around in the 1950s. It's continuing this kind of reinvention, Saugatuck's reinvention, right, extending back really into the 1920s and 1930s. So May Heath is in part included in newspaper accounts of the dedication of that marker because she is the granddaughter of pioneers that came to Saugatuck and to Singapore in the 1830s. And in 1930, she commits herself to writing really the first complete history, the early history of Saugatuck, which is still really the starting point for reading about the early history of the area, in part because she knew people, right, that were born in Singapore in 1930 in the community. And the book is published in 1930 to coincide with Saugatuck's centennial. So in 1830, 100 years earlier, the town is officially platted by William and Mary Butler, what is Newark at the time, and then becomes Saugatuck much later. But I want to read to you what May Heath writes about Singapore in 1930. When we speak of Singapore, the buried town, people often look askance and wonder if we are telling the real truth or just a fairy tale. But it is true, and for a number of years, Singapore was a thriving lumber town. Singapore near the mouth of the Kalamazoo River is rich in legend and lore, which is cherished by the pioneer children, some of whom were born in the now buried town and living in Saugatuck today. It was a busy lumbering town then and held the homes of about 200 people, while now nothing but dreary wastes of sand marks the spot. Visitors today can scarcely realize, as they tramp those dreary windswept hills, that beneath their feet are the streets and perhaps dwellings of a village. And as one looks about over the broad expanse, the first impression is one of beautiful stillness. And one can picture in the days of Auld Lang Syne that here human hearts struggled with the trials of a primitive life and won for a while. So this really struck me, and I want to share that lengthy description with you. It certainly holds some of that kind of romantic feeling that we heard from the 1887 account, different direction to it. And so there's a nostalgic value in the mythology of Singapore as Mayheath writes about it. And there's also a sense of challenge overcome that's implied in this as well. This was a challenging place, a hard scrabble existence for those pioneer families as she describes them. But that there is something of coming through that process that makes them better. And I think an important part of this is situating Mayheath's description of this history, right, with what's happening in Saugatuck, the context of Saugatuck by the early 20th century, right? So this marker in front of Village Hall helps us sort of understand this kind of imagined history that Saugatuck takes on. And we can see that in this transformation of the old fire hall built in the 1880s, same building. In 1928, Carl Herman, painter we talked about earlier, redesigns the Village Hall and gives it this really wonderful colonial revival, federal treatment that makes it look like something kind of lifted out of colonial New England or early national period New England, and sets it here and really helps transform this community and have this kind of vision looking to the future. Saugatuck's relationship with Singapore is a complex one. Saugatuck is established before Singapore in terms of date, but it doesn't get quite the visibility, right, in terms of lore, but also in terms of its closeness to Lake Michigan, right, in the mid-19th century. But there are mills and tanneries operating in Saugatuck by the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. We get this view from Mount Baldhead from 1874 and see the very active working waterfront. And a photograph here looking towards the newly completed bridge parallel to the Blue Star Highway crossing today, looking from Saugatuck towards Douglas. And again, we see this kind of portrait, this kind of celebration of industry, of the harvest of the forest, with the logs in the river in the foreground here. The Allegan Atlas from 1873 gives us a sense of this broader landscape that it's not just Singapore or not just Saugatuck on the landscape. By 1873, Douglas is established, New Richmond, Fenville, Pier Cove, all appear on this map. We also see the railroad running to the east through Fenville and New Richmond, heading from north to south. And we see an inset of Singapore as well in this 1873 atlas that gives us the indication that some of those lots have sold and are filling in, but it is very irregular in 1873 here. In thinking about the history of Singapore, another historian to highlight, perhaps less known by some, is Charles Lorenz. Charles Lorenz is a founding member of the Saugatuck-Douglas Historical Society and a thorough researcher. He devoted himself to research on the early history of Saugatuck and Singapore, the Black Lake region. At one time owned the Old Wing Mission House in Holland, which has been very much in the news lately. And much of that research goes into what is really his kind of master work, which is the early history of Saugatuck in Singapore from 1830 to 1840. So this is intended to be a multi-volume work, multi-volume project. He self-publishes this book in 1983, and unfortunately he passes away in 1994. So he's not able to complete the 1840 to 1850 section or later years as well. It is an incredibly thorough history that really emphasizes, I think in terms of even the scope of the work as he lays it out, really emphasizes meticulous research, both primary and secondary source research, and not only in the community here at the lakeshore, but in fact reaching out to libraries and historical societies in New England and across the upper Midwest. His approach to history here, I'm not going to read this whole thing, is really notable, and I'll show you a couple of pages from the history as well. One, for lack of a better way to say it, the quaintness of it, this kind of self-published manuscript history, but is absolutely packed with information. As he says here at the beginning, it was written to bring together many sources of research material available today, but not so 50 years ago. The volume is footnoted so that anyone with a more intense interest can go back to the original source material for more detailed examination. And so as we look at this source, we can really appreciate the importance of sources, the importance of comparing, identifying different sources, and really evaluating them. And with that as well, of taking kind of a bigger view, a kind of macro view of the forces that are shaping Singapore and Saugatuck. So analysis of land ownership by parcel, sort of year by year, is laid out here. We made reference to Kalamazoo Canal that may have been, that started in 1837 and 1838. Just so you're all aware of what could have been. This was the kind of golden age of canal building. The Erie Canal opens in 1825 and sets off this kind of explosion of movement, of travel, of migration, of trade between New York City and upstate New York and the Great Lakes. And so by 1838, there's plans underway. The state appropriates money to begin work and begin selling stock for the building of this canal, which would have gone from Mount Pleasant, north of Detroit, across Michigan, all the way to the Little Rabbit River, and then to Singapore and out to Lake Michigan. So you could have had a barge, you could have gotten on a barge and gone from Lake St. Clair all the way across Michigan and made your way here to Lake Michigan. So this would have been a huge boom of investment and of activity had this happened. It did not happen in part because of the Great Panic of 1837 that really collapsed the economy for about 7 years after that. And speaking of collapsing the economy, Singapore's Wildcat Bank. So we talked a little bit about the Singapore dollar paper currency as one much discussed detail, way of knowing, way of remembering Singapore. And to kind of explain this very quickly, banks were allowed to be chartered under this Wildcat Banking Act by the state of Michigan. And they could print currency, which would be redeemable for specie beyond, across other banks, right? Across these other small banks. All currency in this time period is backed up by precious metal, right? By specie. And unfortunately, regulation was very difficult to manage. I sort of think of this as maybe equivalent to the savings and loan scandals of decades back, or maybe of the sort of Bitcoin cryptocurrency instability, market instability that we see today. But these banks were incredibly useful for allowing people on the frontier, right, in the 1830s to be able to have some way to transfer wealth, to transfer money between here and other larger communities for trade purposes. There's a lot to say about the bank itself. That could be its own topic. What I wanted to highlight here was really thinking about this currency as one way of really thinking about Singapore within this larger network of other communities, of other financial networks in the early 19th century. And one key detail of that stands out as we look at these banknotes is the quality of them. And after the talk, I'd encourage you to come up. We can look at the banknotes up close. The notes themselves were, let me go back to our Singapore notes, printed regionally, likely in Allegan. But the plates, the engraved plates that made the banknotes themselves were produced by Rod and Wright, Hatch, and Edson, which is indicated on the banknote itself. And also clear from the quality of the engraving that was done. And so I bring this up because we don't have a lot of artists working in Singapore in the 1830s, but there is a rich kind of visual tradition, right? And in part that's traveling around through things like banknotes like this. They unfortunately have very little direct reference to the places themselves. So this firm, which was nationally known, was established in New York City in 1832. They were designing and printing for U.S. postage stamps in the 1830s, as well as doing banknote engraving that went all around the young United States. And you can see they're kind of stock elements, lots of classical figures and allegorical emblems that are kind of brought together. And of course, why? Who cares? Why spend all this money on plates? Counterfeiting, right? You want to have something really high quality that people can discern this is not a counterfeit banknote. Or at least you would want to be able to discern if it was a counterfeit banknote or not, if it actually had value, right? Which by the late 1830s, these banks collapse, right? No one's willing to really put their money into these local banks because there's really very little backing up their value. And merchants and other bankers are not willing to take those notes because they're just not sure they'll get their value out of them. This note, so these are uncut sheets that were never used, never issued. In order for them to be valid, much like a check or much like the printed signatures that are on our paper currency today by the Secretary of the Treasury, these were actually signed. So officers of the bank actually signed and dated these. You can see here December 25th, 1837. I think this is Oshea Wilder's signature that's on here as well. Kind of an interesting insight into thinking about the economy of these communities. You can read a whole lot about the bank from Charles Lorenz. The bank building is understood to have been moved from Singapore first to Mooresville, near where the Southern River is today, and then by the 1890s to its location at 317 Butler Street. So this building is believed to be the Singapore Bank, the building where the glazed brick vault was installed in it, where gold and currency was kept. And here it is, photographed around 1900. It was a grocery store, and today the art gallery and bookstore. The Astor Hotel is another major building that gets a lot of discussion in accounts of Singapore, both really aggrandizing accounts and also more realistic ones. It certainly would have operated as a boarding house in the 1830s and 40s and after. It was a two-story building on a raised basement with a rear L projecting off of it. And accounts, early pioneer accounts, give quite a bit of detail talking about the building. I wanted to highlight another of our really important historians for thinking about Singapore and thinking about the whole history of this area, Dr. Jim Schmeeken. I included some notes we had in the archives of some of his research on the big house, or on what was described as the Astor Hotel, probably in a somewhat derogatory way, the Astor Hotel, because it was a pretty humble, rough and tumble place in the mid-19th century. Jim's history, I think, is important and has some contrast with the earlier historians we talked about, in that he brings his skills as an architectural historian and as a preservationist to really thinking about what's the kind of architectural space and architectural features, characteristics of Singapore and of Saugatuck in this 19th century period. If you don't have a copy of Raising the Roof, we have those available for you for sale here. You should certainly have a look at that, because it's such a thorough investigation of the architectural history of the area and the broader history and how that informs a broader history. Jim's understanding of Singapore is really as a significant place in the formation of community in the 19th century, of really thinking about the social, ethnic, class diversity of people that are coming here to the lakeshore in the mid-19th century. Not focused on New England settlers that came here, but also some of the immigrants and working people that came here. And you see some references to that in these notes that are pulled together. We also see photographs of extant buildings in Saugatuck that were likely moved. There's evidence these buildings were moved from Singapore into Saugatuck after Singapore's collapse in 1875. We're getting to the end of time here, but I just want to make a couple of quick points about what happens to Singapore that it collapses at all, right? And we can think about that in terms of environmental catastrophe and also economic collapse, right? Economic abandonment that plays out. As we look at our photograph here from sometime around 1870, we can see two mills in this photograph, one in the distant background and one sort of in the middle ground of the view here. We get this incredibly crisp detail. We can see that it's a steam-powered mill with this great smokestack rising up here. We can also see the hazards of mill work in the 19th century. And on the roof of the building, we see rain barrels there along the ridge. So if a fire broke out, there's no municipal water, right? There's no fire hydrants or sprinkler systems. And so workers would be expected to run up these ladders and have access to these barrels to try and douse any fire that might start. There were a number of fires, a number of mills that burned on the site in Singapore specifically. You can imagine when you are cutting wood and generating sawdust and generating a lot of friction and a lot of heat, the risk of that is quite high. Dangerous work. We get a sense of anonymous workers in these photographs, but both the figures that we see kind of among the lumber piles here that would be loading this schooner to take lumber across Lake Michigan, but also just the sheer sense of scale, right? The kind of physicality of moving green, freshly sawn timbers and planks, of loading those up. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of jump ahead here. The Chicago fire is a critical moment in the history of Singapore. It's a great economic opportunity for this mill town to sell a lot of building materials to a city that is absolutely destroyed by multiple days of fire. You get a sense of the scale of this. For Chicagoans, probably nothing new to you, but this kind of gives you a sense of the sheer scope of the devastation of the fire in terms of across the city in 1871 and the visual sense of that devastation that plays out. And in the decades that follow, right, the lumber markets of Chicago are booming with construction and expansion in Chicago, and also feeding the hinterlands, right, feeding the opening of the West, the Plain States and beyond. This is a kind of double-edged sword for Singapore. It's a time of great prosperity and in high industrial production, but also it leads to the exhaustion of those ready timber supplies along the Kalamazoo River. And by 1875, Otis Johnson and Francis Stockbridge, who are teamed up at this point as co-owners of the mill at Singapore, make the decision to dismantle the mill equipment, put it onto their schooners and tugs, and move to a new site at the Straits of Mackinac at St. Ignace. And so the Mackinac Lumber Company is established in 1875. September 29, 1875, the ships sail out of the mouth of the Kalamazoo River, and that's basically the beginning of the end for Singapore. During this time period, they operate for 17 years at St. Ignace. You can see it's a major operation and cut over 200 million board feet of lumber. And so you get a sense of the scale of this just from this kind of bird's eye view of looking at that. And would be remiss if I didn't point out one of Mackinac Lumber Company's most famous products, which is the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island. So Francis Stockbridge owns the site and then goes on to help finance that, find financing to build the Grand Hotel. So direct Saugatuck connection sort of between Mackinac, many direct connections, but this is a really visible one. As we wrap up here, pulling some things from the archive, things we remember and things we forget, this history of the Singapore site as we look forward into the 20th century is a topic for another lecture altogether. This was donated to us, was a presentation drawing. It's noted, it was presented in July 31st, 1979 by Christopher Chomelis of Chicago. And it's for the Oxbow Country Club to be built on the Frank Dennison site. And I don't know, maybe some of you know, was this on the North Shore or would this have been on the South Shore, this proposal? This would have been proposed for the South Shore. To just pull out some details, it's as described, it's a country club with an 18-hole golf course, condominiums and single-family homes. Here's a rotating restaurant, a clubhouse that was here, and parking as well. So you've been able to drive out on the dunes and on a road and park out on this. So this was not built. And we know that there's been great efforts to preserve the landscape that we see here and some great challenges in preserving the dunes over the last several decades, and many other proposals that have been brought forward. As we look ahead, we can sort of ask questions and see, what are the archaeological resources that remain in the ground in these places. It is certainly enormous potential to learn more, but really requires full cooperation, right, to be able to preserve these spaces. The final piece I wanted to kind of close with was coming full circle to the importance of the landscape and the characteristics of this landscape of the Saugatuck Dunes and the Singapore site. Is really thinking in a poetical way about this. So in the Saugatuck Dunes book, Alison Swan has written an essay on the freshwater landscape. And she says, people have found livelihood, living space, and inspiration in the Saugatuck Dunes for thousands of years, but the dunes have never been more than lightly or briefly settled. Even in terms of modern history, Singapore and Fishtown were a flash, a hustling, bustling, tall ship flash, but a flash. Sand, like wind and water, is always on the move. In the open dunes, even a breeze leaves tracks. Here a grass blade tip has carved a perfect circle, and there a dead oak leaf has sketched a mysterious track across sand smoothed by another wind. A steady stream of human admirers preserves an old trail and makes a new one. It's perhaps right, then, that we should mostly visit and not stay too long. The dunes are alpine fragile without alpine remove. It matters even where we step. The Saugatuck Dunes are a refuge for wildlife and for people. A fitting point to wrap up the presentation, in my mind, of thinking on this landscape that has, from Anishinaabe pre-contact times to today, I think has always seen change, has always seen people coming and going and coming again, and is in this constant state of change and transformation.